Live.
You're live. Great. Thank you, Dylan. And echoing Eric's comment a few minutes ago, I am so excited to see so many of you joining us for this reunion, taking some time out of your day to visit us. Welcome. This is the official Spatial Music Workshop reunion since we can't do something in person this year. I think everybody knows me. I'm Tanner Up the Grove, the Immersive Media Specialist at the Institute for Creativity, Arts and Technology at Virginia Tech, and I'm joined with my co-directors, Eric Lyon and Kyle Hutchins. Maybe you guys could introduce yourselves just briefly. You guys, not everyone may know Kyle, but I think everyone knows Eric as well.
Yeah, so I'll do the quick introduction. So I'm Eric Lyon, and I started the Spatial Music Workshop back in 2015, and it is just so overwhelming to see everybody. And so I'll shut up and pass the baton over to Kyle.
My name is Kyle Hutchins. I'm artist teacher of saxophone at Virginia Tech. I'm also a past participant in the Spatial Music Workshop and the artistic director of this version of the Spatial Music Workshop. Eric asked me to take over as he launched the inaugural I4 residency this summer with ICAD.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm taking notes as we're doing this because this is new for all of us. So I'm looking forward to your feedback as well. Trying this out, and if this goes well, one thing we could do is do this again, or maybe you guys want to do this on your own in another way. So one comment I have, I should have built in some time for everyone to briefly introduce themselves, or at least had bios on the webpage. So that's any kind of feedback you guys have after this. I'd love to hear it to make this better. This is the 6th year of Spatial Music Workshops, so we've been doing this for a few years now. We thought it'd be a good time to catch up, maybe share some best practices. Where are you now? If you have any really cool new things, we put out a call for proposals for the Speed of Sound Talks, and we got 5 responses, so I'm looking forward to hearing those. After we do the Speed of Sound Talks, we'll go into a welcome session to our 3 Spatial Music Workshop participants for this year, which will move to a future date. And following that, we'll have more of an open house roundtable discussion and get your input. So I'm pretty jazzed to see everyone here. The response has been overwhelming. Almost everybody that's been in the workshop has signed up to come back and participate. So thank you for your time again. We are streaming this live on YouTube. If anyone needs help getting that link to their friends, let me know in the chat and we'll share the link. All right, and then you can do that at any time. So again, we recognize we can't cover everything right now, but if this works out well and you guys want to do it again, let's set up another time. So enough of me talking. How about somebody else talk? We'll start with the Speed of Sound Talks. And if you didn't see the additional information on the website, there's more information and links and bios available for you there. Dylan or Eric or Kyle, could you drop that into the chat just in case someone needs it? And during this time, these are brief talks up to 10 minutes in length. They're presentations only, no Q&A at this time. So we'll keep them up to 10 minutes. And if you have any questions and answers, maybe we could write them down and follow up with the presenters at a later time. Great, so I'd first like to welcome Dr. Javier Garavalgia. I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce your name correct, even though we chatted earlier.
So, hi, Garavalgia, yeah.
So thank you for signing up to present. And if you'll kick us off with your presentation.
Yes, I will. Now I have a problem. Share screen. I'm going to make a PowerPoint presentation, so I will talk through it and I will show you more or less what I'm doing there. So I'm going to share the screen, okay? So let's see if this works. Pause disable attendee screen sharing. Oh, it doesn't allow me to share.
Try it now.
So, yeah, now it allows me to do so. So, okay, so Are you viewing this? Good. So let's start. The idea is basically to make a presentation as a brief summary of the developments of my work with high density loudspeakers arrays since I visited the first spatial audio workshop at Virginia Tech in August 2015. So because we don't have too much time, let's go back to 2015 and then go through the years. So in 2015, I attended the first spatial audio workshop at the Cube, Virginia Tech, and the HLI at this moment had 134 speakers and 4 subwoofers to our disposal to experiment. And my aim was to test my system for HLA specialization for the first time. And the system is called granular specialization, and I'm going to refer to it as GS from now on. It is programmed in Max software. It offers a flexible way to produce multiple spatial settings in HDLIAs, and I think I'm going to put this somewhere else. Oh, I can't, or can I? Yeah, I can. Sorry, no. And the result of the workshop was the composition and the world premiere at the Cube of a piece called Spatial Grain Soundscape #1, which is acousmatic music for HDLA specialization that combines GS with Cubisonics, which we all know is the ambisonics, especially programmed by Eric for the cubic hall. In 2016, Eric and I made a joint presentation at the Beast Feast 2016 at the University of Birmingham about the experience of the first spatial audio workshop in 2015. Later in the year, in the New York City Electroacoustic Music Festival, Spatial Grains was performed in a reduced version for 16.2 speakers, and I had to replace the Cubisonics by the Ambipan Max at that moment. And later in the year, I participated also in the ICMC in Utrecht at the Tivoli Vredenburg complex. And I had another performance of the piece, this time in 16.4 reduction and still using Ambipan. And also I had a paper in the proceedings, which talks quite in detail about what granular specialization is, what the Spatial Audio Workshop 2015 was, and what I did do, and of course, how I did compose the piece, Spatial Grain Soundscape #1. 2017, in January, I got an article of my authorship published in the Computer Music Journal, which is about my main subject here, which is to create multiple spatial settings. And in this case, especially with granular specialization, and especially about the entire experience in the Cube at Virginia Tech in 2015. In the Beast Feast of that year, the University of Birmingham here in the UK, I also made a presentation creating multiple spatial settings. So the same thing as the article. And I presented some examples in the MIDI Dome there at the university. At the end of the year, I participated also in the InSonic 2017 in Karlsruhe, Germany, where I had, for the first time since August 2015, a real performance of the Spatial Grain Soundscape #1 in a real HDLA at the CKM's Corpus Hall. And the version was adapted for all 47.4 speakers there. And also for the first time, I incorporated the ICST ambisonics by Jan Schachter and Philipp Kocher, who both work at the ICST in Zurich, for ambisonics of the 3rd and mostly on the 4th order in the Max patcher. And this allowed me to have in a single patcher, GS included and ambisonics now adaptable to any HDLA and any number of rings within that HDLA. But most importantly, in 2017, I started a new project, which basically is a series of compositions for high density loudspeakers arrays, working with, of course, granular specialization combined with ambisonics, but also the pieces will have to work only with synthetic sound programmed algorithmically via supercollider and occasionally C-sound. The different composition will therefore share the same sound or very similar sound materials and object. However, they will be completely different organized and they will be completely different pieces. The thing is, they will be very much related. And they will incorporate the main subject of this presentation, which is to work with spatial antiphonies for their specialization. So in this situation, what is meant by spatial antiphony in this context? So let's think about it. So let's start with the definition of antiphony. And it is music in which an ensemble, in this case, an ensemble of loudspeakers, is divided in distinctive groups used in opposition, normally spatial, and using constructs of volume, pitch, timbre, etc. So in my conception of spatial antiphony, the requirements for my idea should be to have a huge HDLA of at least 100 speakers or more. So still Virginia Tech is very much in my mind. And the specialization should be exclusively of stereophiles using GS and ambisonic programmed in Max. And the HDLA should normally be divided in two halves. We could have the left part of the room and the right part of the room, all the loudspeakers of that area, but we also could divide it in the front of the rear. So let's see on a scheme here. Let's suppose that this is our complete HDLA. So we have here the left half of that. So the sound will circulate, the left channel of the stereophile will circulate in that area, and the right will circulate in this area. And if not, we could have the opposite, dividing this in the front and the rear of the hall. So the stereophiles should be spatialized antiphonically as signals of each stereo channel move freely in the designed area of the HDLA. Also, the original stereophile or files should have rather different signals in each channel for better recognition of these antiphonic trajectories. And both possibilities, either the left or right or the front rear, can be used simultaneously with different stereophiles, which will create complex and rich spatial textures. The first piece of this cycle, composed in 2017 and finished in 2018, is called Spaces Suspended Scattered, which is an octophonic piece with subwoofer, and it applies antiphonic spatial conception in a reduced way due to the limitations of octophonic settings compared to big HDLAs. In 2018, I participated in the MUSA in Germany and also in the Sound Image 2018 at the University of Greenwich in the UK. And I made a presentation about how to specialize the same acousmatic composition in different HDLAs. By this time, I had played the piece that I composed in Virginia Tech many times. So I had an idea of all the changes and how to react to different speakers, different venues, different numbers of speakers, etc. And in the same MUSA 2018, I presented again spatial grains, this time for an HDLA of 70.4 and using the ICST ambisonics. And in the New York City Electroacoustic Music Festival, I had the world premiere of the second piece that I talked to you before, Spaces Suspended Scattered. In 2019, I participated again in the MUSA, and this time I selected an older piece of mine composed in 2007 called Pathétique. And I made a new version for it for an HLA of 41.2, which applies in full the concept of spatial antiphony. I also read the same paper about specializing same acousmatic composition in different HLAs at the ICMC in New York. And the second piece, Spaces Suspended Scattered, was performed at the Montfort University during the Convergence 2019 festival last September. And in 2020, the same piece was broadcasted by the BBC Radio 3 New Music Show in, of course, stereo. And now we are getting to August of 2020. Here we are talking about all these things that we may or may have not done in the last 5 years. So because time is getting short, only to mention the next steps will be to compose, produce, and perform further acousmatic pieces working with spatial antiphonies in HDLA settings. And I think I have a couple of seconds, but thank you very much for your attention. And now I'm going to stop sharing this.
Thank you, Javier. That was excellent, and definitely the speed of sound.
Yeah, sorry for that, but oh, what happened?
This may be our next presenter.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Javier. Next is Dr. Dale Parson. Dale, I'll let you take it away whenever you're ready. Let's see, let's make sure Dale is sharing screen.
Is the mic on? Oh, there it is.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Too many windows. We'll try again. You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you okay.
Okay, here we go. So this is work that I did inspired by working at the workshop and CubeFest in 2016. And thank you, Eric and Tanner, for that experience and inspiration. I will rip right through these things, but I will try to dwell a little bit on the high points about it. There's a picture of the planetarium. I'll talk more when I get to some diagrams. But I will say for this one that it's circular seating, which is kind of unusual. Modern planetariums, especially the bigger ones, have everybody facing in the same direction, and they have a non-circular setup. This one is circular. It goes back a ways. And the chairs are in 3 concentric rows around the central podium, holding 85 people altogether. I'll show you the dimensions, but the circular arrangement represents some opportunities in addition to challenges. Some of you may know Juwan Park right here, who also performed at CubeFest in 2016. And we've collaborated on things across the years. He was in Philadelphia for a while, so that's where we got to meet up. All right, this is one of the main things that I want to emphasize. If you've never read Blesser and Salter's book, Spaces Speak, Are You Listening? Especially if you're doing spatial music in venues that aren't designed specifically for musical performance, this book is a godsend. So just a couple of quotes. They define this oral architect as being both an artist and a social engineer. It's interesting that they don't say anything about acoustics right there, but social engineer because they have to work with spaces that are often managed and priorities set by other people that may not be musicians, and that's a lot different than the cube. Some oral aspects of the space are fixed, so you can't do anything about it. That's much of the truth for this planetarium. Some of them are variable, and many of those aspects are driven by non-oral priorities. For example, the speaker setup that I used for this is not permanently installed, so it requires setting up and tearing down when you have events or you're doing research. The book's not just about acoustics, but there are some key acoustic considerations that I'll touch on. One of them being reverberation time and reflection patterns, and another frequency response. The paper and my bio are linked on today's event page. So if this advertisement works well, feel free to read the paper and send me email. Here is from CubeFest 2016. A colleague of mine drove down for the performances. And I was playing no input mixers, which if you're not familiar with that, you basically take the outputs, drive them back into the inputs, and you have a form of feedback-driven analog synthesis with some digital downstream post-processing. And so I was playing that, but I had worked a lot in the planetarium before with graphical to spatial correlations. Not the spatial part so much, but visualization of audio actually. Starting out with Gawang's Sound Peak early on, using that to visualize audio up on the dome. In the case of the cube in 2016, what I did was pulled the floor plans down, built myself a 3D graphical model of the cube during the month before going to Blacksburg. And for performance, I had 3 satellite cubes flying around the cube. I could rotate the cube. I could change the orbits of the satellites. I could change their speed. And what each of those satellites did was direct one of the audio channels out of the no input mixers to that side of the speaker banks. And so I was not doing any kind of sound field or wave field spatialization. This was strictly sort of more traditional channel based. When a satellite would be on a given side, then basically it would drive all the speakers on that side of the cube, including the top and the bottom as sides. And as it transitioned across corners, it would mix across those. I had started a super collider script before I got there, and Eric taught me 10 times more super collider than I knew when I left home. And so it would basically follow the speakers around. One compositional note I want to make about this that comes into play in the planetarium is that I had it so I could correlate a full side with the location of the satellite cubes. but my attempts to write code to break a surface apart into subregions, I had a timing bug that I never got out by the time of Friday evening's performance. And I decided, well, I don't want this to end just on what I have been playing up until that point. And so I decided to essentially decohere the spatialization. And in this case, what that means is that I moved the point of view of the 3D graphical camera into the middle of the cube, which basically smashes out perspective, and destroyed the spatialization at the same time, pretty much randomized it. And the metaphor for that is if you're standing off to the side of a crowd, for example, the spatial location of the crowd is obvious. If you then walk into the midst of it, that sort of spatialization is destroyed because you're immersed in the thing. And so there's one aspect to immersion that loses spatialization. And so I decided to use that to finish off the piece. Is basically, if I can't finesse this thing, just ram them in there and destroy it. And I'll show you where that shows up in the planetarium in a moment. There's the dimensions. I don't think I have to dwell on this one too much. They're more interesting ones. But basically, again, you can seat 85 people around in 3 concentric circles around the central podium and circular planetarium. And the dome is a hemisphere, so it's not warped in any way. So we have 35 feet of diameter across, 17 and a half from the projector. So we've got ourselves a hemisphere. I had 8,000 watt speakers for most of the study. I set up only 6 of them. So I have better reflection pattern pictures, so I'll hold off on that. Not a large speaker array. And, you know, these things could definitely blow your ears out, though. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that the outer row of seating at the east and west have the wall immediately behind them. At the north is a large recess area that includes a podium with all the controls. And across the room is another recessed area. We also have 2 hard walls that I have labeled here and here. They're wooden, so it's not like metal. The rest of the walls are perforated fiberboard, and so they have pretty good absorptive characteristics. The room is not bouncy or echoey. There's no slapback echo, and it's not dead. But there are some asymmetries built into the room, in addition to the fact that it's basically curved walls. All right, so one of the things that's important is this 200 millisecond decay time. I tested this out 2 ways: bursts of white noise, recorded and measured. And also I like to yell, so I did that too and got consistent results. So I would just stand there and yell and, you know, record the decay time in the room. And so down 24 dB in 200 milliseconds, and I'll get into the significance of that in a second. I wrote myself a little ray tracing program in the processing graphical language. And here is what we have out of 1 speaker. And remember, there are 6 to 8 speakers spaced symmetrically around the room after 1, 2, and 6 reflections. So it takes about 33 milliseconds to get across the room. This spot is interesting because I had been working in the planetarium for 7 years at the time that I did this study and never did this sort of thing. And so after I did the ray traces, I had the speakers set up at that point. I got the room all summer. And I went and sat in the seat that is almost directly underneath this focal point, and you don't really notice it. And if you, and if you stand up though, and get your head at that spot, the sound absolutely sounds like it's coming off the back wall, the wall opposite of the speaker. I mean, it's intensely so. And so as soon as I heard that, I walked to the wall. And as you walk to the wall, because you're walking out of the focal point, the effect totally dissipates. I mean, the sound is just sort of diffuse across the wall when you're back at the wall. I walk back to the point, and obviously you're in the focal point again. So that focal point is potentially dangerous from a performance point of view or useful. But the nice thing about that focal point is that it's about 2 feet above your head when you're seated. And I'll show you a vertical diagram. But when you sit down, that focal point almost completely dissipates. And so even though that's a potential problem, when someone's actually performing and the audience is seated, you don't notice it. In the worst case, we could block off the seats, and that would be 6 or 8 seats, depending on audience size. That's a feasible thing to do. But really, if you're sitting there, you don't hear it until you stand up.
Yeah, this is here, just a notice 60-second warning. Thank you.
Oh, okay. The secondary reflection is not bad, and it's in the same direction as the speaker. And so we don't worry about that. Here's what I wanted to get to from Spaces Speak. Basically, he talks about a small time window between 100 and 300 milliseconds for creating the experience of listener envelopment. And so at 200 milliseconds, basically my summary of the sound in the room is that it's crisp, but with mild resonance. So you don't get mushiness. When the sound's coming out, it unifies with the first 2 reflections, but it's not at all mushy sounding. No slapback, but there is sort of this gentle reverberation that sustains for a little bit beyond that. There's the 2 feet above your head. So this is why you don't hear that reflection. I teach no input mixer, and dry mixers don't have any particular instrument sound. And so I turned the room into a mixer, no input mixer. Basically put an Omni mic in the middle, run it out to Ableton Live, split it up into 6 channels and drive the 6 speakers with it, bring that thing up really slowly because you're playing feedback across the room. And having taught no input mixer for years, I found the room to be completely dry with respect to coloring the tonality. And so I was very happy. All right, last bit here, compositional. Keeping spatial correlation to sound location works up to a point and then you lose it. And this is where I get back to smashing people into the cube, is that you can take it up to a point where it starts to become tedious to keep track of the correlation, and then you just overdrive it. This is a form of tension and release again, where the immersion means losing the spatialization. And so you can go back and forth between making it obvious what the spatial correlation is with the graphics and making it impossible to track. And as I say, that's a compositional form of tension and release. So there's a lot more in the paper, and feel free to talk with me during the discussion or send me email if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. Appreciate that. Sorry to cut you off. To keep things moving, next we have Dr. Eli Stein presenting. Eli, if you'd like to request a screen share, we will get you rolling.
Absolutely. It is so awesome to be here and see all these people that, that are just passionate about spatial audio and getting involved with spatial audio. I was in the same spatial music workshop as Dale in 2016. Awesome experience. The Cube is an amazing place. Today I'm going to be talking a little less technically and kind of more about my relationship as a composer and technologist to bioacoustic research within an artistic context. So let me just get started with that. So specifically, I'm going to be talking a little bit about bioacoustic research that is revolving around intertidal oyster reefs. And I'll talk a little bit about methods that I used working with these recordings that we made using hydrophones on the oyster reef, and give you some thoughts about working with multi-channel systems with respect to this project. So I'm going to play a couple sounds, some of which are binaural, but you don't necessarily need headphones to enjoy them, but if you do, it'll be all the better. So the genesis of this project came about in 2018 and 2019 with a collaborator at University of Virginia. And we went to the coast of Virginia and were able to record 200+ hours of hydrophone recordings of these intertidal oyster reefs. And the thrust of this research done by myself and Martin there was to see if we can use hydrophones as a surrogate for incredibly expensive oxygenation measurement equipment, which you can kind of see over here on the left. So these oyster reefs putting out hydrophones sound like this. Oops, there we go. So there's this whole world of snaps and pops, which come from pistol shrimp, which are using that to stun their prey. There's the sound of fish. There's the sound of the water moving. So it's this wonderfully rich sound source and ecosystem to work on. So we did a lot of research with the sound, analyzing it, and that work is still ongoing. We've presented it at a number of different venues around the world, and we're continuing to work with this data and working on a paper right now. But since I'm in front of a bunch of artists and technologists, I'm going to kind of shift gears and talk more about the artistic side of thinking about how can you take 200 hours of an oyster reef, this ecosystem, and work with it as an art object. So this was done in the context of my dissertation. If you're interested in that, you can check out that link, elistein.com/this. And this dissertation was revolving around how can we take natural systems, put them into a computer, and work with them in the context of immersive electroacoustic sound. And this was one of the projects within that dissertation. So the first thing that I did thinking about this corpus of 200 plus hours was work with it by hand and kind of think about ways in which I can process the sounds of the oyster reef. And one that I found that was really fascinating that I hadn't done with another sound source before was using very extreme vary speed. So just speeding up these sound files, in this case by 200 times, using a really cool command line tool called SOX. So I'll play this for you. This is a simulated octaphonic setup. So 8 tides sped up by 200 times. And it's a really awesome kind of sound that comes about from this. So you may or may not have heard it, but there are these squealing sounds, these kind of rising and falling whistling sounds. And I think that those are boats moving very slowly, just sped up. So they get into this audible range of kind of a whistling, which is pretty amazing to kind of recontextualize this ecosystem just by changing its time frame. I'm going to skip the second example just so I have, I'm a little faster. But just thinking about working with this corpus by hand and manipulating it in different ways. So switching gears, I thought about how can I work with this corpus kind of in a more scientific realm? How can I think about it as mappable data? So in what ways can I think about these sounds as data and use them as a source of information or rhythm or just musical data? So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but in general, this is taking Bernie Krause's acoustic niche theory and applying it to this oyster ecosystem. And to do this, to kind of take these oyster reef recordings and think of them as an ecosystem that I can map onto another sound source, for example, thinking of it as data, I basically split it into different frequency subbands and then did event detection on each of those subbands. So for example, if you have like a snapping shrimp that happens up in the high frequencies or a boat moving in the low frequencies, it allows you to kind of map that onto a different sound source. So here's an example of that. You're going to hear the oyster reef way in the background. And then on top of that, I have some sounds that I just created to map onto. There's some high tinkling bells and then some low bass. But the idea here is that I'm taking the activity within the oyster reef and mapping it onto different sound sources. So that's all automated, just kind of thinking about the oyster reef as a data sound source very simply. I wanted to expand this even further and make it intelligent and work with acoustic feature extraction, taking, for example, the sound of the fish and having that create sound A, or the sound of the snapping shrimp and having that create reliably sound B, using a variety of different analysis techniques and mapping techniques. I have a paper that talks a lot more in detail about this and the system that I designed that I presented at the Intelligent User Interfaces conference back in 2019, not so far back, but I'll play this. This is what I just described, this kind of intelligent mapping, again, from the oyster reef onto another sound source. And this is in 5th order, higher order ambisonics, full 3D, here decoded to binaural. And this is, again, fully automated, and all the trajectories and stuff are derived from the oyster reefs. So to me, this is an entirely different sound world, but it kind of captures the ecosystemic qualities of the original. And like I said, this isn't a technical talk, it's very short, so there's a lot of hand waving, but if you're interested in the more nitty gritty details, I'm happy to provide them. So summing up, my goal as an artist when working with this experience of the oyster reef and also this corpus of sound recording materials is 3-part. The first is thinking about the corpus as sound, as this acousmatic material that I can play back over speakers. The second is thinking of it as data, as this kind of ecosystem from which I can derive activity and a kind of texture of triggering sounds or manipulating sounds. So thinking of it not as sound, but as data. And the third, which I haven't talked about, is one that's very real, which is this kind of larger story of reefs in general. So human reef relations, which are remarkably terrible. Over the past century, we've much more than decimated natural reefs. And then separate from that, kind of just thinking about this beautiful life cycle of the reef, which involves going from just a bare sand bed to a thriving ecosystem. So for me, kind of thinking about telling this story in these 3 different ways, working with sound, working with data, and then this kind of general story, the platform for this is immersive multi-channel sound. So I thought it would be something that would be of interest to this group of people. And I'm continuing to work on this. So if you have any interest, just drop me a line. You can find my contact info on my website. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Eli. Excellent. Next, we have Dr. Ted Moore.
Oh, I'm not a doctor.
You're not?
No.
Today you are.
Oh, awesome. Okay, I'll share. And, but I need to do the audio thing. Okay. So today, do you see this? Great. So today, I'm just going to talk about an algorithm that I've been using in my spatial audio work and in other work, and that I find really useful. And I hope others who are working in the cube or interested in spatial audio will also find it useful and perhaps dive into playing around with it. So the algorithm is called non-negative matrix factorization. And what this algorithm does is it is able to analyze a sound file as a spectrum, which is the matrix, right? And it's able to identify and separate individual sound components that are in that sound file. So this is a drum kit beat that we're looking at here. And it is able to identify the kick drum in the bottom, the snare drum that's sort of in the middle, and then also isolate the cymbals that are sort of in the upper register. And so we can hear an example of that. You'll hear the drum kit in its entirety first, and then you'll hear those 3 different components separated out. Gesticulate wildly if you don't hear this. Oh. So I'm sure you can already start imagining ways of using this in spatial audio. I'm going to go through some more of the technical components of it, and hopefully it'll give you a more sort of intuitive understanding of what is going on and how to think about it. So this is a saxophone multiphonic, same thing. And here's one with speech that you'll hear doesn't work quite as well. But I will say that one of the parameters that you can use or specify when using this is how many components the algorithm should look for. So for all the examples, I just chose 3, which obviously makes sense for the drum kit. But here's a speech that is decomposed into 3 components.
The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog.
So what's actually happening when this algorithm decomposes a sound like that is for every component that you request, so in this case I said 3, it returns what's called an activation and a base. And the base is kind of like a spectrogram representation of the component that it has discovered. So a spectrogram of the kick drum and a spectrogram of the cymbals. And then the activation is a time series representation of the amount that that spectrogram is present in any given time in the sound file. So here is a picture of the bases for that drum kit. You can see the kick drum is low frequency content. The snare drum is a little bit higher and a little bit noisier. Then the cymbals are very noisy and very broad spectrum. And then here are the activations for those spectra. So the kick drum, you can actually see the rhythm of these different drum set pieces and sort of where they occur in the sound file. So once we get the activations and bases, there's more sort of combinatorial things that one can do. So here I've rotated what activations are triggering which bases. So we get sort of this drum kit sound swapping that happens. Here's an example of the drum kit activations triggering the 3 bases from the saxophone multiphonic. Here are the drum kit activations triggering bases that were taken from just like Eurorack synthesizer sounds. And lastly, another thing you can do is take those bases, which are like spectral representations, and you actually use them as spectral filters. So here's an example of the drum kit signal, just the raw drum kit sounds being filtered by different bases from the saxophone multiphonics. Sort of turns into a vocoder sort of sound. And now here's the saxophone multiphonic. And then all of them mixed together. Which really ends up being a vocoder using the saxophone as the source. Okay, so for spatial audio, when I was in the Cube, I used this algorithm a lot, and these are the ways that I used it. Obviously, I would just decompose a mono sound file and then spatialize those separate components. But also one thing that's nice about this algorithm is if you sum those components, it actually recreates the original signal. And it can also have if you invert the phase and add, it'll null to silent. So it's really a precise recreation. So I would have the components all in one speaker, right? And I'd hear the original set source, and then they sort of spread out to the rest of the room, or vice versa, having those sounds compose or decompose themselves. Also, I used onset detection so that I had a sound that would be decomposed and spatialized, but then each one of those components would be analyzed for onset detection and then trigger motion through the space. So each component was moving separately, even though together they all were creating a composite sound. I used each wall in the cube. I used a different bass as the spectral filter, and then just played the same sound through the entirety of the cube. But even though it's the same mono sound file, we still get a very spatialized effect because it has these very idiosyncratic filters filtering it in different places in the cube. And then a couple other things that it can do that are kind of interesting. It's called NMF cross, which is what you heard when I was mixing and matching different activations and bases from different sound files. And then lastly, another thing that I have used it for, not in the cube, but elsewhere, is classifying live audio according to different bases that you match it against. So it's able to identify, right now it sounds like we're a snare drum, or right now it sounds like we're listening to a kick drum, or right now it sounds like we're listening to a cymbal, and sort of using those classifications in real time to trigger other live audio processing. And lastly, just places where you can find and use these algorithms. There's a group out of Huddersfield in the UK that I have been working with called Flucoma, and they're porting a lot of sort of more esoteric DSP algorithms, but also a lot of machine learning algorithms, and porting that work for Max and SuperCollider. So you can find their tools are available online to download. And there's also some great ports by a student there named James Bradbury, who has ported this stuff into Reaper as scripts that are super easy to use, and it's really slick. I would definitely recommend checking that out. And then lastly, the place where I first encountered this was the Librosa library for Python, where there's a very straightforward NMF algorithm that you can get at the data, the activations, and the bases really easily. So those are places to check them out. That is all.
Thank you, Ted. Excellent. All right, well, next we have Steve Ellison. And Steve's going to present visually. There we go, got it. And Steve, let's see here.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining, and thanks, Tanner, for inviting me. Today, I'm going to talk for a few minutes here about a new application, spatial sound mixing control tool called SpaceMap Go. I work for Meyer Sound and director of spatial sound at Meyer Sound, and have had the privilege over the last couple of years of working through some prototypes, explorations of how to do real-time control of sound as a spatial mixing tool based on the SpaceMap algorithm. And SpaceMap is a technique for algorithm for mixing sound to any loudspeaker combination. So at the Spatial Music Workshop, I used software that was in a kind of a prototype stage using Lemur to build a user interface, controlling software in Max, using some Meyer software that is used to control Dimitri, and did some modifications of that. And with that, kind of prototyped the system to allow me to live mix to the cube with 100+ loudspeakers. Eric Dahlman, who played trumpet, and I had some synth tracks, pre-recorded tracks as well, in the in the music that we played back, so and performed. So there's a couple of elements of the software. This is iPad control software for a processor called a Galaxy, and this is a control application only. In this case, I have 2 systems of Galaxies. Galaxy on its own has 32 inputs and either 8 or 16 outputs. And those inputs are a combination of physical, analog or AES input or AVB. AVB is an emerging standard for multi-channel audio support, and we've been working with that extensively over the years. So here in my home test rig here, I have a couple of systems, and I'm streaming 20, in this case, I have 4 channels of AES coming into a Galaxy. I have 8 outputs for a very simple test. And I'm streaming AVB from my Mac. So what's great is that you can stream Mac straight from, stream AVB audio straight from your Mac into the device. And the device also gives loudspeaker processing, EQ, delay, trim, etc., so that you can manage the multi-channel system. And then once it's all set up, you can then control it with this interface. So this is the mix page, and the mix view provides sets of 8 channels that allow us to do live mixing, and we can link channels through some different kind of relational techniques. There are some 2 channels that are moving together. Here are 2 that are mirrored. And the control for this is through the space map. So if we zoom in, then we get the channel page, and the channel page provides control of a single channel and kind of zooming in on detail, which includes both kind of gestural trajectory playback and control, as well as live touch positioning. So for instance, if I want to bring up a M for Moogfest, now this is flipped upside down. You can reset this and play this one channel. We're now playing a trajectory through the channel. I can then now with my fingers kind of manipulate that and drag and speed it up and so forth. So you can take a simple gesture and create different sorts of patterns with a simple move. Space Map is a amplitude-based panner, and you can experiment with it through a interpretation, or a version of this was done for Max MSP that we helped Zachary Seldis do, called MIAP. So if you search for Max MSP, MIAP, M-I-A-P, that'll get you into some of the tools that are freely available. There's quite a bit about what Space Map's all about, and Debates has also written quite a bit about it, and it's done an article. So there's some trajectory control that we have. We can now look and see there are the 2 channels that are moving. This is an interesting space map, and so I thought I'd do in the few minutes I have. Tanner, give me like a 1-minute warning, if you would.
Sure thing. I'm
just going to take a tour through what a space map is. This is very simple. This is kind of like the very basic starting point. It's like quad setup. So in this quad setup, we have 4 channels, and I can move a channel, and there's these are the 4 channels. In this case, I have UPM, which is a minor loudspeaker, a pair of those in the front, and a pair of MM4s here to make this quad. And then in the green dot you see right here is a subwoofer, an MM10, so that's derived. And in the center is a virtual node. So it's a node-based system where it uses barycentric math, which is related to VBAP in that sense, to subdivide a plane of nodes and then kind of work the problem into something simple. So here we're panning between 3 nodes, 2 speakers and a virtual. So that's a 4.1. So now let's look at 5.1. So this is a 5.1 where we have that center channel in the front. But what gets quite interesting is when you could take something that's, you look at it one way, could look at it at a different way as well. So for instance, here is another 5.1 map that as I move here, we're moving around these 4, but the center channel is not panned if I'm taking this path between these 2 nodes, whereas if I take this path, I'm getting to the center channel. So you can start thinking abstractly, and it's an abstract panner, which lends itself to some fun discoveries of how to control sound. Let's look at something a bit more with a couple of layers. Let's look at a 7.1.4. So this is a top view of a system with 7 lateral channels that you see around you on the edges and on these 4 overhead, right? So as I move across, this is the right-hand side, and as I move up, it's going up and over and down. So it becomes very simple to control something that's complex. And now if we go, let's say we have the ceilings. Now let's get a little bit more abstract. Let's just say we want to move sound between layers. And this is something I did at the Spatial Music Workshop, because the cube has so many wonderful layers that I created space maps that allowed me to just move sound through entire up and down throughout the space, right? So here's one way to do that. This is a bit confusing to look at, but it does the job. We're essentially using these virtual nodes. When I'm at the top here, like the top and the 4 are lit up, those 4 speakers. As I bring down, you'll see now that the edge speakers are lit up. And so this is, but there may be a different way to do that. So if you can then say, okay, I'm not going to marry myself with the physical locations of the loudspeakers, it gets a lot easier to do some cool stuff. So here is all right, here's the 4 speakers up top.
Got about 1 minute, Steve.
Thanks. So here's the 4 up top, and if I bring down, I'm at the bottom set. So by changing how I'm looking at it, it's a manifold approach. So we're changing how we're looking at a regular space by projecting it in a different way. And then another example of this would be a system I'm working with here, kind of similar, is a collinear arrangement. So let's say if you just have 6 loudspeakers in the front. We then test this, see if I move back and forth. This is set up to give fine control pairwise panning. And as I bring down into the y-axis, I'm then grouping sets of loudspeakers. So I can change the width with the y-axis and the kind of the basis or where I'm panning in this array of 6 with the left-right. So then kind of the piece de resistance is to combine that, and
this will be the last component.
Perfect.
Please. Thank you.
And so this is a case where I can provide control over left and right, make it fine or coarse, and then bring it to the surrounds and move. So this is what we've been working with, and I've been. It was great fun working at the Cube and working with Eric and Tanner and company, and exploring ideas there, and MoogFest with Virginia Tech. So thanks to them, and looking forward to future spatial audio adventures with you.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for sharing what you're working on and cool projects. At this time, we're going to take about a 15-minute break. I put the link to the next Zoom meeting in the chat in case you didn't get it, but it's also in email and the Google Calendars. So again, thanks for presenting, Javier, Dale, Eli, Ted, and Steve. We appreciate it. And we will see you guys in about 15 minutes to meet this year's Spatial Music Workshop participants.